welcome to this very interesting conversation that I'm having with Dr. David Frawley and Mr. Patrick Brauckmann, two people who understand the ethos of what Hinduism stands for, maybe far better than a lot of Hindus. They've read, understood the scriptures and what really does Hinduism stand for. But this conversation will cover a lot more than just a Hindu phobia. It will focus on what the Nepalese Prime Minister's comments regarding Lord Ram really meant about the conversion factory that continue unabated despite 6 years of Prime Minister Modi's government, how they continue in almost all of Northeast and several parts of South India as well. Beyond that, the temple movement, is it expected to get a fresh impetus after the recent verdict of Swamy Padmanabh? And beyond that, of course, the global narrative as far as India, Hindus is something that we will be focusing on and touching upon in this conversation. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
First things first, I want to start with the comments that were made by the Nepalese Prime Minister, Mr. Oli. And while a lot of them have been dismissed as somebody who's just, probably speaking off the cuff, it is not a low-ranked official in the Nepal government. This is the Prime Minister of the country making a remark that clearly could undo the spiritual religious ties that bind India and Nepal. Dr. Frawley?
Well, first of all, he is accepting the spiritual ties that bind India and Nepal, because he's recognizing that Lord Ram is very essential for Nepal. In fact, he's trying to bring Lord Ram into the Nepalese identity. And in doing so, he's also recognizing Lord Ram is important for the people of Nepal. So my comment was very clear. If Ram is so important for you, why don't you start a government based on Ram Raja rather than on Marxism and Maoism? And why don't you honor your greater connections with India, Bharat, sharing this Ramayana tradition? Certainly, Lord Ram belongs to Nepal. I think we could say Sita was born there. I think that seems to be the case. But it's very indicative that the Nepalese are attached to Lord Ram, and that does bind them to India. And historically, Nepal has always been very close to India, part of Indian culture, could have been part of the Indian state if things went differently. So I think the Nepalese Prime Minister, in trying to separate India and Nepal, has in a way created a basis also for bringing them back together. And this idea of turning Nepalese against India is silly, because when you go to Kailas Mansarovar, which we did some years ago, you go through Nepal, and Nepal's connection with all the Himalayas, with Lord Shiva, with all the temples. Nepal was a Hindu state. Nepal is still in essence a Hindu state. So the Prime Minister should recognize that and stop trying to kowtow to China, which has never honored Nepal and has devastated Tibet. Nepal doesn't want to become another Tibet.
I'm going to come to Tibet in just a bit. But before that, Patrick, let me ask you about the comments by the Nepal Prime Minister, and do you think there should be a counter reaction that should come in from India as well? Because this essentially is the backbone of Indian or the Hindu faith.
Yeah, I don't think reaction is the right approach. I think compassion is the right approach in this case. That the whole region is Bharat, and they no question have their own distinct identity, but the communists have had their way in Nepal for such a long time, with the economies that are at stake right now. He's playing his cards towards Beijing right now, and it's more posturing. He's having a difficult time internally, though. The communists, communism everywhere is failing, and so it's only a matter of time. And Nepal is a youthful country, so communism doesn't really play out too well. India needs to be doing a more effective job in unifying and in sharing the vision, of two distinct nations, but with a commonality. And communism is not that commonality.
Mm. I remember that it was just a couple of years back where the Prime Minister had also announced that tourist circuit from Ayodhya all the way till Sita's place of birth, and that was in Nepal. Again, an attempt to really tie the spiritual and religious fabric of these two countries stronger. Do you think in the backdrop of those attempts by the Prime Minister, these comments could do some serious damage, or how do you assess that, Dr. Frawley?
Well, first of all, as you've noticed, if Sita was born in Nepal, they can claim Lord Ram too if they want, but either way, they're connected to Bharat. And there's been the effort by Prime Minister Modi to awaken the whole Ramayana circuit, which goes all the way to Sri Lanka, which goes through Hampi, which goes through so many places, Chitrakoot, Ayodhya. And of course, there was the rebuilding of the Ram temple in Ayodhya, which is an extraordinary event after all this time. So the awakening of the devotion and importance of Lord Ram, and Ram as the Dharma Raja, Ram is the Lord of Dharma for all of Bharat, and Ram Raja for all of Asia. Ramayana is the most popular book all the way throughout, even Indonesia, Bali, you find it. So I think that affirmation of the importance of Ram is everywhere. And Nepal should recognize that their embracing of Sri Ram is what all of India and much of the world is doing. It doesn't need to be a separative movement. It should be a movement to bring all of the Dharmic civilizations together. Even the Buddhists honor Lord Ram. So let's all honor Lord Ram together. He can be in our country, every other country. He is everywhere anyway. Yeah. But let's use that to embrace our Dharmic civilization, not to go off the deep end of Maoism, which is, a shadow from a superficial, materialistic political shadow from the previous century.
Right. Yeah, I think that furthering Dr. Frawley's comments, that the immediate reaction from Hindus and India in general should be wonderful. Lord Ram is from Nepal, if you want it to be, but what does Lord Ram have to do with communism? That should have been the first question. I mean, go straight to that heart of that conversation. And I think that's a more appropriate way to look at it.
Mm. Yes, indeed. But I cannot finish this conversation around Lord Ram and Ayodhya till the time I cover and talk about the temple that is currently being constructed. How hopeful are you that when this temple comes and the construction is completed, it could really be a milestone as far as the larger Hindu awakening that both of you have spoken about, written about, so very, so much in the last couple of years. Patrick, you want to start with that?
I'm heartbroken because I was supposed to be there 4 months ago and missed it. But I think it's one of the most important developments in Indian politics for Hindus. Everything that's happening around temple reconstruction and revitalization, I think, is central to what the narrative and the theme and everything that the BJP is doing right now. It's essential for nationalism. It's essential for the economy and revitalizing Hindus' perspectives on Bharat and themselves as well. It's reclaiming the truth of India. It's reclaiming its history. It's reclaiming a civilization that ruled the region and has been largely forgotten by history. And so it's a very exciting time. but it's an important time to be, moving forward, as peacefully and aggressively as possible on those particular issues, from my estimation.
Dr. Frawley, several people, in fact, commented that just like what happened in Hagia Sophia is exactly what happened by the courts when it came to the whole Ram Temple decision. I know it's absolutely deplorable to comment and compare, but the fact is this was a narrative that was being pushed the moment the Hagia Sophia decision was taken.
Yes. Oh, by the way, I did experience Diwali in Ayodhya this last time, right before of course, the temple was announced. And that was a wonderful experience. And the Ram Temple will be a World Heritage Center for all the devotees of Sri Ram and the Ramayana. I believe it will be the greatest tourist center in Bharat, and will have the most people coming. It will have museums. It will have all the rituals, all the pilgrimages go on there anyway, all the different throughout the year. So it is a revitalization of India's civilization by honoring its great history that has been denied by the anti-India or anti-Bharat forces. Now, Hagia Sophia was a Christian church, yes, and the head of the Constantinople, the Greek Orthodox Church, it endured for 1,000 years as a Christian church. Then when the Muslims conquered it, they turned it into a mosque, but then that was reversed, I think, only recently by Kemal Ataturk in the last century, who moved away from the Orthodox Islam. So there was no such mosque there in Ayodhya that had that. In fact, the Ram Temple had endured for thousands of years or more. The archaeologists proved it was a Ram Temple. K.K. Mohammed and Bibi Lal, who I've known very well and worked with over the years. So there's no comparable factor there. In fact, it is the opposite. Hindus in India have been the only civilization or the only country today that gained independence from colonial and foreign rule, that didn't take back their holy sites, that didn't take back their main cultural sites. I visited Eastern Europe like Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, they took down a lot of mosques, they reclaimed a lot of their heritage. In their country, the churches had to be kept lower than the mosque, and some had to be underground even to survive. So let's move away from this leftist rhetoric and honor India as the great civilization it is, its history, its heritage, its rituals, its practices, its temples. Hindu temples are the most glorious architectural and even sculptural monuments in the world. And so let us take that point of view, and Hagia Sophia is another matter. And Hindus honor Saraswati, they honor the Divine Mother as the wisdom goddess. They have her in every form.
You want to touch upon that, Patrick, as far as Hagia Sophia is concerned, and then we also talk about the larger Hindu temple movement that Dr. Frawley just very briefly spoke on.
I think I'll leave it with Dr. Frawley's words on that front, but just to further this, the temple, in historically speaking, was the center of civilization. It's how Hindus communicated. It's how the culture was formed. It's how knowledge was shared, and that revitalization is central not only to Hindu culture, but to Indian civilization as it rises. The knowledge that comes out of Sanatana Dharma is vital to the revitalization of the knowledge of the environment, trade, ethics, schooling, discourse on every level. That's what the Dharma teaches, and that's why, historically speaking, India Bharat was a superpower. And the revitalization, reclaiming of temples, and a focus on temples will be key to a strategy of revitalizing India.
And do you think that whole movement as far as getting Hindu temples out of the government or the exchequer's reach, so to say, will get a fresh impetus after the Swamy Padmanabh decision taken by the courts?
Absolutely. I believe that that was a good decision. I think that in some cases, unfortunately, it's it might not be ideal to have the government running temples, but in some cases, privately run temples could be worse. They've got Christians and Islamists running local councils on temples, and that's probably not so effective. And so a local Hindu community that in government at least that's operating for the time being. But this is, I mean, from a perspective of somebody who's on the other side of the planet from Bharat right now, these are challenges and problems that India's swarming on because they're not solved in the last 5 years. Remember that it took 70 years of rot of Congress for all of these problems to develop, and 400 years of colonial rule under the Brits and 1,000 years under Islamic rule. These problems developed over a long time. It can't be expected that it all gets solved in the last 5 or 6 years, and so it takes time, and patience. But faith in something, supreme is going to be key to this, and an understanding of how rich the culture is will be the solution, and patience.
Dr. Frawley, as far as the temple issue is concerned, even during the BJP government in Maharashtra in 2018, I remember this instance very vividly, where in 2018, it was the Shirdi temple which had given, quote unquote, a loan of 500 crore rupees to the Devendra Fadnavis government that time to tide over the state finances. And there was a huge uproar that time, which said that, even when the BJP government is there, our temples still continue to, quote unquote, help the government for all secular purposes. This is what was said, and I'm just repeating that. So essentially, this is an issue that's so close to the heart of a lot of people like yourself. How do you feel that this should be addressed?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize clearly that India is the only country in the world, including all secular nations, where the majority religion has its funds taken from it by the state governments and used for non-religious purposes, for secular purposes, and not given back, where Hindu temples are run by state groups, state governments, not from a religious standpoint, but from a purely social and even political standpoint. This is against all in the United States have more freedom than Hindu temples in India this way. So this is something that's legally and spiritually wrong and needs to be addressed. And Hindus should have the right to run Hindu temples just as Muslims run their mosques and Christians run their churches. In India, it's generally considered that Hindu temples become public properties that governments can use for whatever purpose they want, whereas churches and mosques belong to those particular communities. That hypocrisy has to end at an ideological and at a government level. There's no place in India's constitution for it either. And then some pressure has to become out. Hindus cannot accept that they are being regulated. Even Hindu practices, rituals are being regulated by government officials who have no religious background. And they don't even consult the acharyas about what should be done or what could be done. So they should bring all the Hindu acharyas together to address this issue and decide but for non-Hindus to run Hindu temples or for non-religious people to run Hindu temples is inappropriate. And Hindu funds, people give it money or the donations to the deity. They're not giving it to the state government. So it should be dispensed in the name of the deity, not in the name of the state. If the temple wants to help the state, maybe that is its own particular decision, but there should be no legal obligation to do so. Hindu temples should be free.
And what do we do about the conversion factories? I ask you this, that instances in Northeast continue to remain. Fresh instances are coming to light where indigenous faith has been attacked. You take a look at South India, you have a prominent member of parliament from Telangana, from Andhra Pradesh, saying and making a very important statement that a quarter of the population in Andhra Pradesh is actually now Christian and has been converted. So the scale at which this has been going on is alarming. And do you think more needs to be done, Dr. Frawley, to address this because of the sheer scale at which it's happening?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that India is the biggest target for Christian conversion forces in the world. China doesn't let them in, the Islamic countries don't let them in, India lets them in. Andhra Pradesh has been a center for evangelical activity for decades. Large amounts of money have been brought in. The current chief minister of Andhra Pradesh belongs to that religious group and continues to support them and to give them funding and help at various levels. They even tried to allow them to buy land and have influence in Tirupati itself. The Northeast, on the other hand, has been targeted for conversion for over 150 years, because all over the world, the conversion forces have targeted indigenous, native, and tribal peoples, Native Americans, Native Africans. The Blacks in America have lost their native religion altogether. The Native Americans are still under siege. We live in a part of America, New Mexico, has a large native population. Our Navajo friends say they live in a village of 3,000 people and have 19 different missionary groups targeting them and now targeting their children also, even through the social media. Even in Hawaii, up to a few decades ago, it was illegal for the native people to practice their religion all the way up into the late 20th century. So native people have always been targeted, and this has gone on in the Northeast, but there's a new movement pushing it further that must be addressed. And we must remember that these native traditions represent the spiritual heritage of humanity, our connection with the earth, great ancient cultures that we must preserve just as we must preserve our biodiversity, our plants, our animals. And this movement against India is also a movement against India's culture and civilization. Bharat needs to be Bharat. We need India's civilization to raise the world. India doesn't need to be another evangelical or a Catholic country. They have their own countries. I'm not saying people shouldn't have freedom of religion, but people all over the world are taking up yoga, meditation, Vedanta, Buddhism, Ayurveda from Bharat to raise their consciousness. So let us preserve these. Let us not let them be taken over by a conversion game that's also buying land, property, businesses, and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
You want to come in there, Patrick? Because, this isn't new. But the fact is, a lot of people say that maybe 6 years is a long enough time for some action to have started translating into real impact on ground.
I don't know what the solution is. That's why, it's like, it's almost a futile discussion, although, Dr. Frawley's comments are all factually correct, but what's the priority of a government, to bring, 100 million people out of poverty or to worry about some, conversion factor? It's shocking. I'm on the west coast of Canada right now, where Indigenous peoples were preyed upon by, colonial missionaries and wiped out with, smallpox and blankets, and we had potlatch laws that made in Indigenous language illegal, you know, the sharing of stories illegal. And this is what Christians are doing in Northeast India. They've been doing it for centuries around the globe. Islamists wipe out. It's just part of, you know, human nature. It's shocking and it's horrible and it should stop. If I was prime minister, which I, you know, unfortunately won't be in this lifetime, I'd come up with some law that, you know, nabbed them at the airports, and I'd send them home or something and just do away with it. And I'd fight them for years in court. And I'm tongue in cheek, but do something just to get rid of it. It's a horrible problem and it's meaningful, but there's so many other, you know, bigger priorities that India needs to be focused on. Make it great. For you know, for somebody to feel great about being Hindu again, so you don't worry why would you become a Christian? Look at, as Dr. Frawley's saying, like millions of people are learning meditation in the West, all over Europe, all over the globe. You know, it's only India that's, you know, forgetting that, and they don't see it as cool because they're, you know, media's looking to the West and saying, that's what you want to be. Look how successful Christians are. Christians are falling on their face in the West. That's why they're all learning meditation and yoga. Those are the facts. And so, I mean, yeah, it's a real problem and it's horrible. You know.
Speaking of media, what would you say about the narrative in global media from coronavirus to the anti-CAA riots, to Prime Minister Modi coming to power last year in 2019? There's been a sort of consistency in how the global media has sort of portrayed, isn't it, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, you know, unfortunately, there are great points of light, you know, globally with media, celebrities, reporters, but generally mainstream media has become a greater virus than anything. It's a greater pandemic than we've known. Right now, they're you know, absolutely, you know, focused from March to what was it, the end of beginning of June, focused on coronavirus and telling us what we need to be afraid of, and seeing, you know, social media platforms, you know, rise from the ashes and getting new followers for all of these reporters because they're able to capture us and tell us what we need to be afraid of. Wear a mask today, don't wear a mask tomorrow. This is the fact today and tomorrow is the fact. And so, you know, this is a bigger issue than the virus itself. And so I think that, you know, an understanding of the effect that media can have on people, and, you know, the excess deaths that are occurring by depression and the mental illness that's occurring by us having to isolate and to wear masks. You know, these are really serious issues that the media is not really focused on. And so, you know, George Floyd gets, you know, killed by some thug police, and all of a sudden, the virus isn't so important anymore. And so they've got us worried about that. And now our narrative is about racism and taking down all of the past and canceling that, you know. This is what's going on in the media, and it's a global pandemic, and it's far more insidious than COVID-19 in my estimation.
Dr. Frawley, you want to touch upon the Black Lives Matter movement? That's obviously now taken completely different proportions, started meaning something else.
Yes, but first I want to address the media generally. And I've been, of course, challenging this media bias in India. It's also, to, as you say, some extent globally, like New York Times and so forth, or even BBC has been doing that for a long time. But I will say this for Narendra Modi: he has good relations with the heads of states of these countries, even where the media is criticizing India. And India has a powerful diaspora that's well respected in the countries. The Hindu groups and the Indian population in America is the most affluent and educated of the immigrant communities, except the only other minority is the Jewish community. So this media is also being exposed. There is also another side to it, but it dominates the media that the people in India look to in their colonial bias, to go back to the New York Times, which is now a propaganda piece. It never was particularly pro-India. The sad thing is that there's been a lot of pro-Pakistan forces gain power in the American media, partly because India didn't challenge them. So this media problem is there. And the Black Lives Matter movement, certainly there's this whole issue of racism, colonial oppression. India suffered that, brown-skinned people in India, Hindus not allowed. The attempt to convert all the native peoples, generally they had different color of skin also. So there is a long history of that. And I don't think that needs to be opposed. I think that needs to be brought out historically. What's happened now with the Black Lives Movement as well is there's reflecting a lot of social division in the American country. And I think it's been kind of pushed a bit too far as a current issue. And that I think what's important today is that we create a greater sense of unity and a need for change. Coronavirus is a big problem, but it's a problem that's reflecting our lack of control of our own immunity, our own health situation. And it's something we can address if we approach it together. But if we turn it into a political football, where we name the virus after a person of a political nature, the fact is the virus came mainly from China. There's a lot of Chinese influence in the world today that's, I would say, quite negative.
Yes.
And a lot is there in Tibet and India. So let's look at the real culprits here and not get distracted by issues that may be important, but are not directly relevant to what is happening and most important globally, which is the threat of China and the threat of this virus and the need to have a better healthcare system.
You want to add to the Black Lives movement as we wrap this up, Patrick?
I think that, you know, it's part of an extension of, you know, of the media problem. It, you know, in Portland, Oregon right now, they're rioting every night. This is a state that is run by the Democrats and leftists and socialists on state level, municipal level, you know, on every level. This, you know, they should be a, you know, a euphoric, you know, people, but they're rioting every day, and it's just a symptom of, you know, the madness of the left. And you know, it's what we saw, you know, in the riots in Delhi. It's what we've seen over the last 4 years. The narrative in American politics to be focused on Russia, while China was, you know, far more insidious than Russia could ever think of being. And so, you know, it's really what we're focused on right now. And so, you know, with all things, I think that as, you know, Hindus, we want to be looking, you know, at ourselves and saying, you know, what was the solution that Hindu culture provided, you know, at the onset of the pandemic, and that was Ayurveda, you know, natural solutions, you know, to boosting immune health. India doesn't suffer from, you know, pandemics. All of the modern pandemics, you know, have come out of China, and it's a result of animal agriculture. Hindus don't, you know, by nature, generally speaking, you know, we're not flesh eaters, and China has been creating these problems. So, you know, I think it's really focusing on the real problems and the background of these issues than, you know, than the narrative that the media wants to. But it's really you know, getting to the truth of things, and, you know, having an honest discussion of it. And it's very difficult to do that.
All right. Thank you so much, Patrick Brauckmann, Dr. David Frawley, for this very interesting conversation. We touched upon a lot of issues, and hopefully the government will pay heed to some of those concerns that continue to be as far as what could be the major changes, whether it is about Hindu temples or the conversion factories, or maybe pushing the envelope when it comes to really setting the global narrative straight. Hopefully there'll be some changes that the government would bring about during the course of its term. Thank you so much, Dr. David Frawley and Patrick Brauckmann, for speaking on this curated conversation.
Let's hope they were listening.
I'm sure they are.